Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of November of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. Something big is going to happen very soon. The Ukrainians began testing and stressing the Russian air defense, and the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours in the sky over the Kursk region, air defense was repelling an attack by the Ukrainian armed forces. 2 Ukrainian missiles and 27 Ukrainian drones have been brought down, the governor reported. Later we got another report. We have a video that shows us probably the work of Russian air defense. Anyway, during that attack, the Ukrainians haven't managed to deal any damage to the Russians, but obviously we understand that the main purpose of that attack from the Ukrainian side was not to destroy but to stress and overload Russian air defense. And if the Russians' air defense is empty, then most likely the Ukrainians would attack the territory deep inside of Russian Federation with the use of Storm Shadow missiles, Scalp missiles, or ATACMS missiles. And the Russians did the same. Today we got also a lot of information from the capital of Ukraine, from Kiev. The Ukrainians managed to bring down up to 50 drones of 73 that were launched in the direction of the capital of Ukraine. And we have the video of how the Russian drones were flying above Kyiv without any resistance. The sources are saying that the Russian drones were flying above the Zhuliany airfield, and the Zhuliany airfield is the place where the Ukrainians have deployed their Patriot air defense systems. Maybe the Russians are preparing themselves before another attack with the ballistic long-range missile Oreshnik that we saw in the city of Dnipro. Very difficult to understand, but most likely if the Russians are going to attack, obviously they will attack with this type of weapon if Ukraine attack deep inside of territory of Russian Federation. The next several days are going to be very interesting, so let's wait, and probably the Russians are going to attack the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, most likely the Zhuliany airfield with the Ukrainian air defense systems. We're talking about this part of the capital of Ukraine. Now let's move to the line of combat contact, and first we're going to talk about the town of Velyka Novosilka, where the Russians, as a result of offensive operations during the previous 24 hours, managed to improve their position significantly. So this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 24th of November, and during the previous several days the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. So for example, this is the map that we used to see by the end of the 19th of November. The Russians were very far from the village, from the town of Velyka Novosilka itself, and very far from the village of Razdolne. And the distance between possible Russian edge positions between the, let's say, trenches to the west of Shakhtarska and Velyka Novosilka itself was around 5 kilometers on this line, and the distance between the village of Shakhtarska itself, the Russian edge positions, and the Ukrainian positions in the village of Razdolne was also around 5 kilometers. And on the 19th and the 20th of November, the Russians began their full-scale offensive operation, and as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Almost every single day we were receiving more and more videos of how the Russians were shortening the distance between the Ukrainian and the Russian positions, and by the end of the 24th of November, the Russians managed to enter the town of Velyka Novosilka itself from the southeast, and the Russians managed to enter the village of Razdolne. So during the previous 4 days, the Russians managed to shorten 5 kilometers distance and to enter both settlements. Obviously, this is the significant progress of the armed force of Russian Federation in 2024. Now let's talk about the details. Let's talk about the geolocations. First, let's talk about the southeastern part, about the farms, about these farms. As for these farms, we got reports from pro-Ukrainian mappers and from neutral mappers that the Russians managed to enter the territory of the farms. As for the geolocations, we have just one video published by the Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainian FPV drone was attacking the Russian vehicles and tanks that were just heading towards the southeastern part and the southeastern farms. And for example, these several attacks of armed forces of Ukraine of FPV drone took place exactly in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted this small part of the map in Russian favor. Anyway, now we are waiting for additional updates from these farms because if the information is correct, if the situation is real, then the situation for the Ukrainians is getting much worse than it was even in the morning, because during the previous update we were talking just that the Russians managed to reach the outskirts, but there were no talks about control over more than 20-30% of this industrial zone. Another important adjustment on the map was presented and was recorded by neutral mappers like Syriac. He reported that the Russians managed to attack and managed to outflank the Ukrainian stronghold, this biggest Ukrainian company stronghold from the south, and to take a rich, dense network of the fortifications and trenches. Now the Russians are trying to maintain the flanks, to maintain the base and the foothold before further advancing in the direction of the village of Velyka Novosilka itself. The situation for the Ukrainians on the territory of settlement is very complicated. The problem is the main problem. This problem used to be the benefits for the Ukrainian army in the past, but now it's a big problem. We are talking about the rivers. There are 3 rivers in this area. There is a river of Kashlagach, there is a river of Mokre Yale, and there is a river of Shaitanka. And these 3 villages split the town in 4 parts. The southern part, this is the territory of the southern part of Velyka Novosilka. We are talking about the western part. This is the territory of the village by the name of Rimevka, we can call it even like this. Of course, we are talking about the central part of the village by the name of Velyka Novosilka, and of course the northeastern part. And every single part is split from another by rivers, and there are just several bridges that connected every single part in one big agglomeration. And of course, we are waiting when the Russians are going to begin bombing these bridges. Some sources are saying that the Russians have already begun doing this, but I believe that as for these bridges, the Russians have just one main task, one purpose. The Russians will keep the bridge in safe until the Ukrainians bring the significant number of forces with the purpose to stabilize the lines and to slow down and to hold the Russians. Because as soon as the Ukrainians bring, let's say, 1 or 2 battalions on the territory of the central part, 1 battalion to the southern part, and 1 battalion to the northeastern part, only then the Russians will begin destroying the bridges, because these Ukrainians that will be located on the territory of these parts would be caught in cauldron without any possibilities, without evacuations, because the Russians might destroy the bridges. So this is the purpose of the Russians. They will wait until the Ukrainians concentrate and collect the critical mass there. Now let's move further. We have additional changes on the ground between the villages of Novy Kamar, Razdolne, and Velyka Novosilka itself. We have 2 geolocations exactly from this part. In this video, for example, we can see how the units of the 14th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Russian Federation were attacking the Ukrainian positions with a significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, and personnel carriers, and the Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians, to stop them with artillery strikes, of course with the FPV drone attacks. Probably some Russian vehicles were damaged or even destroyed, but it didn't stop the Russians. The Russians managed to reach the main defense fortifications of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, to land infantry and to begin clearing operation. So the Russians, as a result of this attack, managed to take under control this small stronghold. Then we got another video, and as for this video, we can see the Russian soldiers that were moving along the 3 lines in the direction from the previous stronghold in the northern direction towards the settlements of Razdolne. We can see Russian units, we can see a very complex network of the fortifications, and this network was captured by the Russians. We're talking about this one, and the video shows that the Russians managed to capture this territory. And this is the second route of Russian attack, and this attack goes from the settlement of Shakhtarskaya in the direction of Novy Kamar and in the direction of Velyka Novosilka from the south. So this is the second route of attack, and we see that during the previous 24 hours, as well as the southern, the first routes of attack, the Russians managed to advance and to take additional territories under control. The third route of attack lays between the village of Shakhtarskaya in the direction of Razdolne itself. And according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to answer the eastern part of the settlement. At least this was stated by pro-Ukrainian mappers, and according to them, now the Russians control around 10% of the settlement, which means that most likely during the next day or 2 days, the Russians will be able to take the entire settlement under complete control, and the battle for the next stronghold is going to start. And we have the fourth route of attack that was reported and recorded by neutral mappers. We're talking about the line between the village of Yasnaya Polyana and the road 0518. And according to neutral mappers, the Russians also managed to take this territory under control, and this allowed the Russians to outflank the settlement of Razdolna from the north. The main purpose of this attack is to cut physically the road 0518 and to cut supply and support of the villages like Novokamar, Velyka Novosilka and Razdolna from support that can come from the settlements like Bogatyr and Otradne. Very important. And now, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the length of the front line that the Russians are using for attack is around 15 kilometers, which is very big. And as you can see, the Russians managed to advance and managed to get additional results on every single square kilometer, on every single kilometer of this front line. So most likely the village of Velyka Novosilka, the town of Velyka Novosilka, would be captured by the Russians even earlier than the battle for Kurakhove-Uspienovka finishes. Now let's move about to the Kurakhove direction. First, let's talk about the Uspienovka stronghold. There are very heavy clashes, and we have the significant number of geolocations exactly from this territory. First, let's talk about the settlement, the village of Trudova. The Ukrainian sources, forces of the 71st Separate Jaeger Brigade, published a video of how they were, after withdrawing the Russian forces on the territory of the settlement, trying to slow the Russians down and not to allow them to take the entire village under complete control. There are lots of episodes, as you can see, and one of them was located exactly in this point. The Ukrainians were after withdrawing the Russians here, and based on this video, based on this episode, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. This territory, this part of Trudova, used to be considered as a contested zone. Now we have no doubts that the Russians are moving further, and they're getting closer and closer to the stronghold, to the company stronghold in the southern part of Uspienovka, this one that is under complete control and the area of responsibilities of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. Now let's talk about the villages like Romanovka, Elizavetovka and Ilinka. As you can see, we have changes on map, and as you can see, according to even this configuration of the front line, we can make a conclusion that there are at least two cauldrons were created by the Russians. We're not talking about the thousands of Ukrainians that were trapped, but obviously maybe several hundreds were trapped on the territory of the city by the name of Elizavetovka, and probably up to 100 was encircled by the Russians in the dense network of the fortifications along the river of Balka Gliniana. And today we got report that near the settlement of Ilinka in the area of the river Sukhi Yali, the Russian armored forces have encircled the forces and the units of the 79th Separate Assault Brigade. Right now, Russian stormtroopers have begun clearing this area. So this is the situation, and that happened, that encirclement happened due to and thanks to the Russian offensive operation that been developing on the line between the villages of Maximilianovka and the village of Romanovka. That was very fast lightning, unexpected attack from the Russian side, and this progress in the direction of the village by the name of Romanovka was confirmed both by neutral mappers and by pro-Ukrainian mappers. And as you can see, as for the pro-Ukrainian mappers, they have adjusted the map significantly. A lot of territories were colored in Russian favor, a lot of territories were turned into the gray zone or contested area. Most likely the Ukrainians began retreat. It's not just retreat, it's probably abandoning positions as fast as possible, and most likely tomorrow and the day after tomorrow there are going to be no more Ukrainian forces on the territory of this artillery pocket. Ukrainians will try to hold the lines as long as possible on the territory of Uspienovka stronghold, but it's just a matter of time when the Russians would be able to crack this net and to move further in the northwestern and in the northern directions. So let's return back, and once again let's take a look at how the situation was developing, let's say from the 19th of November. This is the situation by the 19th of November. This is the situation by the 20th of November. The Russians managed to get closer to the Veselogay from the village of Bogayavlenka. Then the Russians managed to take under control positions in the fields. Another day brought additional progress on the ground in the fields between Antonovka and Maximilianovka, and then we start receiving updates that the Russians began moving along the tree lines in the direction of Romanovka. And by the end of the 24th of November, at least 20 or 30% of the village of Romanovka along the Shevchenko Street was captured by the Russians. Which led now to the creation of several cauldrons in this direction. So the situation is very complicated, and we have also reports that the Russians began moving in the vicinity of the village by the name of Dalnya, trying to cut 0510 road and to get as close as possible to the company stronghold in the area of responsibilities of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade. So the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians. I just remind you that yesterday we got lots of videos how the Ukrainians began destroying the strategical objects on the territory of the Kurakhove power plant. So we have no doubts that Ukrainians are retreating. Most likely the Ukrainians were holding their lines for so long with two purposes: to exhaust the Russians, and while these clashes, the Ukrainians most likely were trying to prepare the next defense belt somewhere in the western part of Kurakhove. And anyway, sooner or later we're gonna see this and gonna understand this. Several days left for the entire Kurakhove direction. As for the city of Kurakhove, the sources reported that currently the clashes are taking place for the school number 5 for this territory, which is also confirms control at least of 10 or 30% of the central part of Kurakhove by the Russians. So let's wait and see what is going to be next. As for the northern Kurakhove direction, according to both neutral mappers and pro-Ukraine mappers and pro-Russian mappers, as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to take the village of Berestki completely, and the Russians are moving further in the western direction, and the next stop is the village of Stary Terny. Now let's talk about the Selydove direction, because as for this territory, as you can see, we have a lot of icons and we have a lot of changes on the ground. So this is how the situation was developing also since the beginning of the 19th of November. So as you can see, the Russians began somewhere on the 19th or the 20th of November, the last offensive. One wave of attack was heading towards Velyka Novosilka, the second wave of attack was heading towards the settlements along the Sukhiye Yali River, and the third attack took place to the west of the village of city of Selydove. The Russians were advancing. We had several reports in the past about the breakthrough, and by the end of the 24th of November, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, to take under control the village of Pustinka, to enter the outskirts of the village by the name of Zhovtne, to reach the outskirts of the village by the name of Pushkine, and to take under control up to 60% of the village by the name of Zarya. All these things, all these advancements were achieved by the Russians during the previous 24-48 hours. And based on this progress that was confirmed both by neutral and pro-Ukrainian mappers, we can make a conclusion that the Russians are planning to move further in the western direction, because the Ukrainian positions are unprepared further to the west of Selydove. There are a lot of no-name farms in this area, very small ones, where the Ukrainians will not be able to hold their lines for a very long period of time. And the next settlement, more or less big settlement, where the Ukrainians can establish or create more or less reliable defense belt, is the settlement by the name of Novopavlovka. This is it. So the next defense the Ukrainians are planning to establish along the settlements of Andreevka, Alexeyevka, Bogatyr, Novopavlovka. So somewhere here the Ukrainians will try to slow the Russians down. And this is very important for the Ukrainians, because if the Russians are able to take under control the village of Novopavlovka, then the Russians will be able to move in the north in directions towards the village of Mizhova, which will complete the outflanking of the city of Pokrovsk from the south, from the southwest, and from the west, and which can lead to significant problems for the Ukrainians on the territory of this agglomeration, and this can force the Ukrainians to fall back from these territories without showing any resistance to the Russians. This is going to be a very huge battle. Anyway, as for now, it's still very far from this situation, and there are still lots of things to do with Velyka Novosilka, probably with the city, with the town of Gulyai-Polye, and with the town of Orekhov as well. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the city of Toretsk. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special from the territory of this settlement, as well as we haven't received anything special from the Chasov Yar. We have several videos from the village, from the city and the Slovensk agglomeration agglomeration. For example, in this video we can see the concentration of the forces of the 13th Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. When the Russians managed to discover their bases, their positions, the Russians began bombing them with Iskander with a cluster munition warhead. Most likely the Russians managed to deal the significant damage. As for the southern Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything special, just small changes on the ground in Russian favor based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian forces. In the vicinity of the village by the name of Lazova, the Ukrainian tank was trying to counterattack the edge Russian positions, and when the tank was empty, Ukrainians successfully returned back. This territory used to be considered as a contested zone. Now we have no doubts that there are edge Russian positions. As for the city of Kupiansk, we haven't received anything. Now let's talk about the Kursk direction, because according to information we have, the Russians began forced counteroffensive. I'll remind you that during the first and the second counteroffensive operations, the Russians managed to restore control over the Glushkova region, over the villages between Korenyevo village and Snagast, and several villages in this square. As a result of the third counteroffensive, the Russians managed to take under control the village of Novovanovka, Zelený Shlях, Lyubimovka, and to take under control several villages in the northern flank like Pogribki, Mariev, Karlovka, and probably the most important, the Russians managed to secure the territory of the Olgovsky forest, this one. And after that, the third counteroffensive stopped, and the Russians, it took probably 2 or something like this weeks for the Russians for regrouping, and also during the 20th of November, the Russians began forced counteroffensive. And as for the forced counteroffensive, the Russians are attacking the territory along the river of Snagast. So this is the river of Snagast, and there are at least 3 settlements on the territory of the river. We are talking about Nikolaeva, Darina, and the village of Nizhny Klin. And as for the end of the 24th of November, the Russians managed to take the village of Darina under complete control, and we have video of a real video that shows us the Russian soldier that was raising both the Russian flag and the flag of his unit. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map, and most of the mappers have adjusted their maps in Russian favor. We're talking about the complex of farms in the southern part of Darina. Some sources reported that the Russians also managed to take under control the village of Nikolaeva, Darina, but we still haven't received anything that can confirm this. But most likely, if this haven't happened right now, this will happen tomorrow or the day after. And we still haven't received anything about the village of Nizhny Klin. But there are very heavy clashes, I understand, right now for the territory of the settlement. Today, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how the Russians using the light vehicles were trying to outflank the Ukrainians on the territory of Nizhny Klin. The Russians were attacking using this route of attack with the purpose to attack the Ukrainians in Nizhny Klin from behind. It's very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to achieve anything or not. Maybe yes, maybe not. We will understand this tomorrow or the day after. If the Russians are able to take all these settlements under complete control, then this will allow the Russians to enter the operational space and to begin real offensive operation in the direction of the village by the name of Sverdlikova, and most likely the village of Sverdlikova is the final task of the forced counteroffensive operation in the Kursk direction. After the village of Sverdlikova, the final battle for Sudzha is going to begin, because there are no more settlements between the Russian positions in Sverdlikova and the city of Sudzha itself. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, push your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.